Og of Bashan, the giant king. Among all the giants mentioned in the Bible, one name stands out with royal weight: Og, king of Bashan. Og was not just a giant. He was a ruler, a commander, the head of a powerful kingdom east of the Jordan River. The Bible connects Og directly to the Rephaim, identifying him as one of the last surviving figures of that ancient giant people. And scripture does something unusual when it speaks about him. It gives evidence. It tells us about his bed, describing it as massive, made of iron, and preserved as a public object, not as poetry, not as myth, but as physical testimony of his extraordinary size. This detail matters because the Bible is saying Og was not a story. He was measurable. He ruled over fortified cities. His land was organized. His power was political and military. Bashan was not wilderness. It was a developed territory. Og represents the final stage of giant civilization, no longer ancient shadowy beings, but structured kingdoms standing in the path of Israel. When Israel encountered Og, this was not just another battle. It was a confrontation with the last visible remnant of a dying age, and Og fell. With his defeat, not only a king collapsed, but an entire line of giant rule in that region ended. After Og, the Bible never again records a giant king ruling a territory. From this point forward, giants appear only as isolated warriors, not as nations. Og stands like a monument in scripture, the last giant king, the closing chapter of organized giant power. Do you think Og's massive bed was preserved to prove giants were real, or to mark the end of their age? The Emim, the terrifying ones. Before Israel ever entered the land, other nations were already telling stories about giants. One of those remembered peoples were called the Emim. Their very name means terrors. That alone tells us how they were viewed. The Emim once lived in the land of Moab, long before the Israelites arrived. They were remembered by the Moabites as a people great in number and great in size. They were not described in long stories. They were remembered in reputation, and sometimes reputation speaks louder than detail. The Bible places the Emim among the ancient giant peoples connected to the Rephaim. This links them to the same deep-rooted giant civilizations that once spread across the region. They were not wanderers. They were settlers. They lived. They built. They ruled. And then they were displaced. The text does not focus on their battles. It does not preserve their kings. It simply records that they were once there, and then they were gone, yet the memory remained. The Moabites did not forget them. They continued to call that land by names shaped by fear. They preserved their identity as a people who were once too powerful to ignore. The Emim represents something important in giant history. Not every giant tribe ends with a dramatic confrontation. Some fade, some vanish quietly, but their psychological shadow stays behind. They become the giants people warn their children about. They become the reason lands are remembered differently. They show that giants were not only warriors of Israel's story, they were part of many nations' histories. Why do you think the Bible preserves the names of giants, even when their stories are gone? The Zamzummim, the feared giants. The Bible tells us that the Moabites were not the only nation with giant memories. The Ammonites had their own. They remembered an ancient people called the Zamzummim. They are described as a people great in number and great in size. Like the Emim, the Zamzummim were counted among the Rephaim, placing them within the same ancient giant line that once dominated large regions of the land. The Zamzummim lived in the territory that would later become Ammon. They occupied it before the Ammonites rose to power, which means before borders, before later nations, before recorded kingdoms. The Zamzummim were already there. The Bible does not preserve their architecture. It does not tell us their kings' names. It does not describe their final battles. Instead, it preserves something more revealing: memory. They were remembered as powerful. They were remembered as intimidating. They were remembered enough that an entire people preserved their name. And then scripture records that they were driven out, displaced, replaced. The land changed hands. The giants disappeared. New nations rose. But the past was not erased. The Ammonites continued to speak of the Zamzummim as the ones who came before them, the giants who once controlled the territory. The Zamzummim show us that giants were not limited to Israel's enemies. They were part of the shared ancient Near Eastern world. Different peoples, different names, same towering reputation. They remind us that long before Israel's battles, giants were already history. Do you think giants disappeared because they were defeated, or because entire civilizations were replaced? The Avim, the ancient coastal people. Not all ancient giant peoples lived in mountains or fortified hill cities. Some lived near the sea. The Bible briefly mentions a people called the Avim. They lived in villages near the southern coastal regions, close to where Philistine cities would later rise. Their settlements existed long before Israel entered the land, and long before later nations claimed those shores. The Bible does not describe the Avim in detail, but their placement matters. They are listed among the earliest inhabitants of the land, peoples who lived there before major civilizations replaced them. This tells us something important. The Avim belong to the ancient layer of history. They were part of the world that existed before power shifted, before territories were reorganized, before nations were renamed. They are included among the peoples who were displaced, quietly removed as new powers rose. No great battle is recorded, no king is named, only their existence. And sometimes, existence is the loudest evidence. The Avim represent how many early peoples, possibly including giants, vanished without leaving monuments or empires behind. They remind us that ancient history is not only made of famous kings and famous wars, it is also made of forgotten villages, forgotten cultures, forgotten bloodlines. Their inclusion shows that the Bible preserves even the faint traces of the earliest inhabitants, those who once lived on the land, worked it, raised families, and then disappeared into history. The Avim are a whisper from the coastal past, a reminder that before Israel, before Philistia, before recorded nations, others stood there. And now, only their name remains. Why do you think the Bible records peoples like the Avim, even when almost nothing is known about them? The Philistine giants, the last warriors. The final chapter of giants in the Bible brings us to the Philistines, a people whose warriors were extraordinary in size and strength. Among them, the most famous name is Goliath of Gath, the giant who faced David. But scripture makes it clear that Goliath was not alone. The Philistine giants were part of a warrior class, feared for their physical stature and combat skills. They were not rulers of nations like the Rephaim or Og. They were the last champions of a dying era. The Bible describes them as terrifying figures, standing head and shoulders above ordinary men. Their presence alone could intimidate entire armies. These warriors lived in the fortified cities of Philistia, Gath, Ashdod, and Ekron. They were trained fighters, often engaging in conflicts with Israel. Their size and skill made them almost untouchable, a living symbol of fear and dominance. Yet, unlike earlier giant tribes, the Philistine giants are remembered not for kingdoms or territories, but for their encounters with Israel. Their story is the story of the last stand of giants, one-on-one battles that would determine the fate of nations. David's confrontation with Goliath symbolizes more than courage. It represents the end of giant dominance. With Goliath's fall, the era of giants as formidable warriors came to a close. The Philistine giants remind us that the age of giants was not just pre-flood myth or distant legend. They were living, breathing people whose size, strength, and reputation shaped the history of the land until the last warrior fell. Their legacy endures in stories of courage, faith, and overcoming seemingly impossible odds. Do you think the Philistine giants were really that tall and strong? Or is their story meant to inspire awe and courage? The Bible presents giants not as myth, but as many peoples across history. They rose, they ruled, they terrified nations, and then they vanished. Yet their memory remains, preserved in scripture as echoes of a forgotten age.